Welcome to our Labor Commission lunch series. We're excited to have you here. We have a lot of people online as well, and so we're kind of doing this both from the in-person and online format. I want to express appreciation to Mike and Jason for all the backroom support and AV work on this. We're excited to have you here, and really what this session is today is going to be about one of the most dangerous areas that we run into, one of the highest loss instance anyway. It's on falls. And I'm reminded, it was interesting, Jeff and I were just talking about a fall we had at a city here just this morning that is a very serious injury, that caused serious injuries and really has the potential of some very significant dollars being paid out. And one of the things that's important as we talk about falls and talk about trip hazards and different things like that, we want to make sure that we really remember the practical element of loss prevention, which is just observation and looking at things, making sure we have an inspection program, particularly that helps us to identify different areas of hazard that we need to address, because that's where we really see a lot of opportunity in our membership, is to strengthen that area. So with that, let me introduce to you Evelyn Partner from UOSH. We're excited to have her here, and we'll go forward. Thank you, Evelyn.
Okay, thanks for having me today. We are going to talk about, like he said, one of the highest number of injuries, illnesses, and deaths that you can have at a workplace. We talked last time about traffic accidents, and that's actually number one for deaths. But this one is the top of what OSHA calls focus 4 hazards. OSHA has picked the 4 most likely things for people to die of at work. And this is number 1, falls. Number 2 is electrocutions. And number 3 and 4 are kind of tied, struck by and caught in between. We'll talk about those other things in different seminars going forward. So today, fall protection and prevention. This is a huge topic. I kind of put together a presentation that melds the general industry and the construction, but be aware that most falls happen in construction that cause deaths. However, there's a general industry side of this that I wanted to point out, and it's really important, and that's the trip slips part of it. So we'll talk about some of the statistics on that. And even though they're not as attention grabbing as deaths, the trips and slips, and they result in falls, do have a huge impact on your bottom line. I like this picture. That's why I picked it. See if I can make this work again. Okay. So this is kind of meant to be a brief overview. It will not make you an expert on this subject. If you have things at your workplace that you need to address this topic on, be sure to get expert advice, because there are many different ways to prevent slips, trips, and falls. And it really depends on what your situation is, what will work best for you. Another thing I wanted to point out, even though I didn't put it on the presentation here, is that this has a lot to do with the hierarchy of controls. If you've never heard of that, go look at the NIOSH website, and they actually have, it looks like an upside down pyramid, and they talk about doing a hazard assessment, and through that hazard assessment, looking at different ways to get rid of the hazards or abate the hazards. So the very last thing you want to do for somebody that might be exposed to a fall hazard is put them in personal protective equipment. There's a couple of reasons for this. People are like, well, we put people in PPE all the time. So one of the big things with PPE is you have to convince the person wearing it that it's worth their while to wear it. So as an example, is if we look at how many people wear their seatbelt in their car every time they drive. So the state actually does go out and look at this, and about in the mid-70s, percentage-wise, is how many people are actually wearing their seatbelt. Even though it's a primary law that you can get pulled over for, people still don't wear their seatbelt. So there's at least 20, 25 people, percentage-wise, that seem to not think of seatbelts worthwhile or necessary. So PPE is the same way. You have to convince them that they actually need it. Then when you get them convinced they actually need it, you have to train them how to use it, and everything of PPE requires training. The next thing is that you have to depend that they won't forget it. I've gone on to construction sites where people forget their hard hats. Well, you'd think that's a duh on a construction site, but it actually happens. So you have to make sure people, and we're all, you know, tied up in our own lives and trying to remember what the next thing we have to do is. We forget stuff. Also, if you're wearing PPE to protect you against a particular hazard, what happens if that PPE fails? Have you gotten rid of the hazard by wearing PPE? No, the hazard's still there. So if your fall protection stuff fails, you're now exposed to a fall that could kill you. So there's those kinds of reasons why you don't want to put somebody into PPE if you can help it. And that goes back to hazard assessment. Assess the hazard, evaluate what can we do to prevent this person from being exposed to a hazard. So one of the things I like about the picture that's on this slide is that it shows that those people up there running around on the roof, they don't have harnesses and lanyards and stuff on. And there's a reason for that. So if you look at the edge of this roof, let's see if I can, oops, did something wrong. Can you put it back on? Wrong button. Okay, if you look at the edge of this roof, we had it almost. Okay, there we go. This thing that's right here at the edge is actually a scaffolding that's hanging off the side of that building. And it's providing fall protection for everybody on that roof. So if they were to fall, they would fall to the deck on this scaffold, and the scaffold has guardrails on it. So that kind of protection is passive. Nobody has to know anything about it. Nobody has to do anything special to use it. It's just there. And it's protecting those people, even on a construction site. So these kinds of scaffolds actually came out shortly after 2000, and they've been around for quite a while, and they are very effective. So what I'm trying to get to is that it's very important to look at the hazard and look at your options. What could possibly be done to prevent that fall hazard? So another one that we see now, more and more actually, is it's really dangerous to put roof trusses up on buildings like this, because you end up having some person have to walk along the top plate to put the roof truss in place. So now many construction companies, especially since there's those little teeny cranes you can set up at the job site, and they're not on wheels, they're like erector sets. Anyway, you can put together a row of trusses and connect them all together and actually put anchorage points on them, and then take that mini crane and lift it onto the roof, that set of trusses. And that way you've already got the things in the relationship they're supposed to be, and you've already got anchorage points if you are going to use fall protection. And you don't have somebody walking along the top plate about to fall off. So the thing that's on this slide too all fall risks are not the same, and equipment appropriate to one application may not be appropriate for another is so true. Also, if your work requires fall protection equipment, get specific training and specific advice. Advice is available from a lot of different places. There are a whole bunch of online places you can find information on fall protection. You can also talk to the manufacturers of fall protection, and many of them are willing to come out and train you for that. So it's everywhere. You can also contact my office. See if I can get this to move. Oops. Oh, we're going the wrong direction. Okay, we're going to talk about general industry, which is under CFR 1910. So CFR stands for Code of Federal Regulations. Even though Utah is a state plan, we have adopted the CFR 1910 and CFR 1926, which is construction. And both of them have requirements for fall prevention. The general industry one is called walking and working surfaces, and then construction is called fall protection. I have some current Utah statistics in here, and these are hot off the press. The two people in my office work for Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they actually collect all of the statistics for Utah. They have just finished, as of last week, this year's survey for the year 2020, and he put those together for me as a special request for this presentation. So these aren't even released yet. They will be released for the whole country. They usually come out around November, December for the whole country. But like I said, we've just finished that for the state of Utah. One of the things I can't stress enough for slips, trips, and falls is housekeeping. You know, your mom told you to clean up your laundry and stuff. She was right. Or your dad was right when they told you to clean your room. Clean your room, because things that people trip over really make up a lot of slips, trips, and falls. I was really impressed one day when I was a compliance officer and I was out looking at one of Costco locations. And I was walking through the place with the manager of that location. So he's the head honcho at that location. And as we're walking through the Costco, he is stopping and picking up any little bits and pieces. And there were a lot of little things, pieces of garbage and pieces of pallets and all here and there. As we're walking through, that's what he was doing. And I said, well, that's interesting that you would pick those up. And he says, hey, it's my responsibility just as much as it's the responsibility of the minimum wage people that work here. Housekeeping is important, and you can prevent a lot of injuries with good housekeeping. So passive fall protection systems. These are required in both the general industry and the construction standards. So guardrail systems, safety net systems, we'll be looking at a couple of those. And then requirements for personal fall arrest systems, or PFAS. Like I said, don't put people in a personal fall arrest system unless you absolutely have to. It's much preferable to do something else, anything else. Okay. Here's the statistics I was talking about. So these are fatalities in Utah for the last 3 years. And you notice that they've kind of broken them out. Sometimes they don't have the numbers for these statistics, which is why 2018 and 2019 are not filled in for material handling. Sometimes the things that they have people fill out for these statistics didn't ask that in those years. So that particular group is a new question that they asked. So slips and trips are make up a considerable amount, and then falls to lower levels. So that counts for anything. Like if I were to fall off this stage, that's a fall to a lower level, but it's also a fall to a lower level if you fell 2 stories. So it doesn't define how far that is. The second table that's on the bottom there shows a little bit of a breakout of these falls. It's obviously not all of them, but they're trying to qualify, well, how much of a fall was that? So that's something that's also pretty new in the record keeping that they are looking at. So it's only really there for 2020. Anyway, it's interesting to see, to me, on that falls less than 6 feet. I have 3. And I have 3 on 6 to 10 feet and 11 to 15 feet. So you can have fatalities at any of these. In fact, I investigated one while I was a compliance officer where the person tripped on a sidewalk on a nice sunny day, and he fell and he hit his head and he died. So falls can be lethal at any level. So here's the serious injuries side of this. And one of the things that I wanted to point out, if you look at the top table, the median days lost. So that means the average of how many days a person was out off of work for that fall was 11 days last on 2020, 12 days 2019, and 14 days in 2018. So what kind of expense is that going to cause for the employer? If important people are off work for 11 days, they're likely getting workers' comp, and they're not doing their job for 11 days. Somebody else is having to pick up the slack. And if this is your key person, that could cause a real problem for your operation. And what's amazing about these statistics is how many falls there are. You'll notice in 2020, the statistics are down a little, but then if you remember what we were doing in 2020, most of us, not a lot of work was getting done because of COVID. So I suspect that these statistics will probably be down in 2020 and 2021 at least, until we get back to what life was more normal, which is what we're kind of getting back to. So it's amazing to me how many of these serious injuries. So OSHA defines as serious injuries as somebody broke something or they were hospitalized. It's not a first aid injury. This is something that caused major injury to somebody. So I put on here the second table, and it shows time of day. And there's really no surprise that the time of day that most people work, 8 in the morning till 4 p.m., that's where most of them happen. So anyway, statistics are kind of fun to look at, but unfortunately, they don't give you all the big picture. So in the general industry standard, it's called walking and working surfaces. And it covers everything from floors to different kinds of stairways. I'm not going to talk about stairways today, just simply because most stairways that we see are compliant with the standard. In other words, it has a riser that's the right height, and they have handrails, that kind of thing. Just be aware that if it's more than 3 steps, you're supposed to have a handrail with that stairway. And there's actually a width requirement. If you have wide sets of stairs, like for instance, going into your city office building, you have to have intermediate handrails if it's over a certain width. So that's all in this standard. And this standard was revised in the general industry side recently. And with the update, they included information on things like spiral staircases that weren't in the original standard. So it's not a bad idea to go read through this standard in the general industry side on stairs. So walking and working surfaces, they can have all kinds of reasons why people have slips and trips, especially if they're wet or have other liquids on the floor. So one thing that a lot of employers have done, say for instance, if I work at a fast food place and I tend to have grease from the fries on the floor, a lot of employers have gone to requiring employees to have certain types of soles on their shoes. And these soles are designed to have a better grip in these kind of situations. And that's one way that you can try to mitigate that. Of course, the best way is going to be back to housekeeping. Clean it up. Make everybody responsible for cleaning it up. If they make a mess, spill a drink, whatever, clean it up. So another thing that we see a lot of is materials that are just left in a place. And I've walked into storage rooms at local cities and counties, because that's what I spend my time doing. And you walk into the storage room and there's tools and materials and junk sitting there on the floor. So don't allow that condition to happen. If you have more stuff than the space has space for, get a storage shed or even one of these shipping containers with the doors on them. Put the stuff in there, and that way it's not rattling around your storage room in your buildings. Anything that's in a workplace should have a place to be, a place that it's stored at. And don't allow employees to just go in and drop it wherever they stand, because tripping over those kinds of things does cause injury. If I trip and fall and break my wrist, it's going to be a problem. Also, improperly stored items that can fall over unexpectedly and cause trip and fall hazards are another issue. And then in the winter, it's hard to think of this now because it's so blinking hot around here, but in the winter, we have problems with ice and snow. Try to keep up on that and keep the ice and snow cleared from walkways. We get a lot of serious injury, slip, trips, and falls in the winter from people going from their car to the building door and the walkway had ice on it. Also, another thing to consider, especially for women, if you're walking around in the winter, don't be walking outside in high heel shoes, because those things, I hate them personally. I hate high heels, but they are not the best thing for getting a good grip on ice and snow. So bring an extra pair of shoes if you want to use those in your office. Be aware of those kind of things. So how do you prevent slips and trips? Really, a lot of it's through regular inspection and cleaning. Pick stuff up, clean up the messes. Don't say, well, it's somebody else's responsibility. It's everybody's responsibility. Putting tools and materials away. If you have a messy process that's always going to be messy, make a change of where you have people walk. So they're not going to walk in the area that's always going to be messy. Put up warning signs. That can help, especially if you're doing something like going out a door and then suddenly there's a step down. A good idea is to have a sign on the door saying, step down. Also, you can help that with painting the edges of steps. So I wouldn't want to paint the carpet here, but there's 2 steps up on this platform that really blend in with the rest of the carpet because it's all the same color. Well, if you have a person that can't see well in low light, and by the way, if you're getting up there in years, that could be you and you didn't even realize it. So I've actually had cataract surgery in both of my eyes, and it was amazing to me how much more light the world really has, because it was like looking through sepia pictures. And I didn't realize that's what it looked like because it had happened over years and years and I just got used to it. But I really didn't see well in low light situations. So another thing you could do is add light to those situations. Put up an extra fixture, light fixture. You can even make it come on only when there's somebody in the room. We have that technology now. So there's all kinds of stuff you can do to make slips and falls less likely. So here's the actual standard under both the general industry and the construction of what is required of employers. So basically they say the same thing, except as provided elsewhere in this section, the employer must ensure that each employee on a walking working surface with an unprotected side or edge that is in general industry 4 feet or more above a lower level. And you'll notice down in the construction, I've highlighted 6 feet. So this is one of the idiosyncrasies of OSHA standards. No, they're not the same. And by the way, if you're in the construction side and you're doing steel erection, you don't have to have fall protection until you get to be 2 stories above the lower level. So it really depends on what the application is, but general industry 4 feet, general construction 6 feet. So keep those numbers in mind. So 4 feet, for instance, how high is your dock? If you have a dock where you put trucks and unload them, those tend to be between 3 and 4 feet high. So maybe the dock even needs some sort of fall protection when you're not using it. Anyway, if you have this more, that 4 feet or more above a lower level, it has to be protected from falling by one or more of the following in the list. So a guardrail system is passive. You don't have to know how to use it. You don't have to have any training. It's just there. A safety net system also is passive. However, safety net systems, we rarely see these in Utah. I'm not exactly sure why. If you are to go on a trip to any of the big cities back east, you'll see safety net systems all over the place, especially on high-rise buildings. So I'm not exactly sure why they're not seen in Utah too much, but that's an option. And then personal fall protection systems, such as personal fall arrest systems. So that's a system, if you fall, it will arrest your fall and keep you from hitting the lower level. Travel restraint. So that's a system where you hook somebody up and they cannot get to like the edge. This thing keeps me from getting there, so I can't fall. A positioning system is something that you attach to somebody when they're going to be doing work in a static position, and it just holds them there. So the best I can think of for a positioning system is somebody who's tying rebar on a wall that's going to be poured with concrete. So those guys that tie rebar, they sit there and they tie these little wires around all the little crosses where the rebars cross, and they have their harness on, and they've got 2 side lanyards that are about 2 feet long, and it keeps them there. They can't go anywhere. So those are the 3 types of personal fall protection systems, and it really depends what you're doing, which one will work. And the construction side basically says the same thing. So like I said, a guardrail is a passive fall protection system. One of the things about guardrails is that you have to have it strong enough so that if somebody were to fall against it, they wouldn't fall, it wouldn't break. So an interesting little side note here that is required in the construction side is if you're wearing stilts, like for instance, we see drywallers wearing stilts all the time, then you have to have the guardrail system raised to the height it would do you good on those stilts. Otherwise, it's just a tripping hazard. So for instance, I like this picture where this guy is doing something in a newly constructed building, and he's got absolutely no fall protection whatsoever next to him. He's not wearing anything. There's no guardrail system. If he happens to forget where he is, and it happens, and just keep shuffling to his left, he'll go right off the edge. Also, it's a really good idea if you have something going on where you could possibly push or kick something off of the upper level onto a people below, to have toe boards. Because especially if it falls very far, things can make it a really bad day for people below, especially tools that can be heavy, made of metal. So this standard also says the top rail has to be 42 inches plus or minus. So either between 45 and 38 inches. Oops, one too many. There's a delay in this system. Okay, so the construction standard has a lot it says about mid rails. Mid rails are important because you could have a person falling in the act of falling and they end up on, you know, their hands and knees are about that level. And if the guardrail's at 42 inches plus or minus 3, you could have them fall under the guardrail and still fall. So mid rails are important. And you can make mid rails out of a lot of things. There's not a requirement as much for strength of a mid rail as there is for the top rail. And you can make it mid rails out of screens or mesh, and that actually works as a toe board. So here's the requirement for what a guardrail system has to withstand: a force of at least 200 pounds applied within 2 inches of the top edge at any outward or downward direction. Any point along the top edge, it should be able to handle that. So mid rails have a force of at least 150 pounds, so 50 pounds less than the top rail at any point along the mid rail. I like these two pictures because they actually illustrate what we come across when we're going out there and looking at, these are construction sites, but the picture that is on the right, as you're looking at it, is a balcony off of some multi unit. It's going to be a living, you know, apartment building. And you'll find that people put crappy guardrails on these things because they know that there's a permanent guardrail that's going to be put in. But ironically, guess what goes on the building last? The permanent guardrail quite often is the last thing that goes on these kind of buildings. So you look at that picture and you think, gall, if I leaned hard on those two pieces of wood that come towards the building and they're just toenailed in, I think I would probably fall through that. And also the guardrail, if you notice, the only supporting thing on that is it is nailed to the floor. So if you were to push hard, probably that would come off. And that has happened in the past. So the other picture shows an actual well thought out guardrail system around a hole in the floor. And this would withstand that 200 pounds and 150 pounds pressure. We see really bad guardrails all the time. So here's a picture of a safety net, and there also are debris nets. So what's the difference between a safety net and a debris net? Well, safety nets are required to be closer to the level where somebody could fall. You're supposed to limit the fall distance 6 feet at the most. A debris net could be 1 or 2 floors below, and it's meant to catch tools and equipment and materials, especially if you're doing this like on the 11th floor of a skyrise building. That's probably why we see these more and more in the big cities back east, because somebody will buy a whole floor of a building and decide to remodel it, and the floor is like the 27th floor. They put debris nets below to keep any of the remodeling stuff from falling on the people walking on the sidewalk below, because that could kill somebody. So here's a slide that I wanted to put in here because though you've probably heard these terms before, these are really important for OSHA. a competent person, and a qualified person. So the competent person is the one who, because they've been at this for years, or they went through training classes and they worked, for quite a while in this business, they know what they're doing. And it may not be, classroom training. It may just be years and years of experience. So a qualified person is one of those people who has a degree or certificate or professional standing that they have been awarded because they've gone through the formal training to do what they do. A lot of times when we're talking a qualified person, we're talking a engineer type person. And that's who has designed all commercial personal fall arrest systems. They're designed by structural engineers. And structural engineers are the ones that design buildings and guardrails and things like that. The competent person is the one that's usually in charge of the crew and knows what's good to do and what's bad to do and can recognize hazards. So those two terms are really important to know the difference of. There are some things in this standard that require a qualified person to sign off on. So, personal fall arrest systems. You've probably all seen one of these. So when I first started at the office in 2000, they had just put this in place for construction, this standard. And a simple harness like the one this guy's wearing would cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 to $500. They were very expensive back then, and they were very simple. They didn't have all the cool bells and whistles we have now. So now you can actually get a bucket, and I have one back at the office, that has a harness and a lanyard in it for about $50. So the reason the price has come down is the technology. It's like anything with technology. When you first get it, it's really expensive. And then as it gets more developed and people make more things of that technology, the price drops. So you can get a harness and lanyard. It's basic, but you can get it for like $50. So there's really no excuse to not have a harness and lanyard if that's what you need. One of the caveats I would tell people is make sure that the harness is the size rating for the person you're going to put in it. They do make very small harnesses because they're seeing more and more women in construction, for instance. And there are some really small women that these average harnesses just don't adjust small enough. If it's not properly adjusted, even if the person's got it on, they might fall out of it. Also, there are some very large men out there, not just tall, but heavy. And many of these harnesses are not rated for that size of a person. So you need to make sure that whatever harness and lanyard you've got, the rating is right for the person you're planning to put in it. In fact, I recommend people assign the harness and the lanyard to the person, because then that person is responsible for it. And that person does the daily inspection of it, which is required by the standard, besides an annual inspection that's supposed to be done by somebody other than the person that wears it all the time. So just as important, here's the 3 things you have to have personal fall protection system. An anchorage point. You can have the coolest harness and the coolest lanyard, and if it's not attached, it does you no good. So you have to have an anchorage point, and it's got to be rated at not less than 5,000 pounds per person attached to it. So keep in mind when you're trying to figure out, where do I put my anchorage point? Can I take your typical mid-size 4-wheel drive pickup truck and hang it from that point? If you're not going to be able to put a truck on that, it's not a 5,000 pounds anchorage point. And one of the things I've seen people think that it's a good anchorage point is guardrails. Guardrails aren't rated for 5,000 pounds. Also, the piping that goes across ceilings that carry water and other things, they are not rated as an anchorage point. don't put an anchorage point on one of those. 5,000 pounds is important. The reason it's important is that if you fall in a harness and the original standard says you can't fall more than 6 feet. Okay, at 6 feet, you get enough momentum built up with your body mass that when it was trying to stop you, you could pull on it as much as 5,000 pounds. So you've got to have an anchorage point that will actually do the job. So here's a picture of an anchorage point that I have in the office. I almost stopped and brought it today, but I didn't have time. This is a funky looking thing. And what it is, you squeeze the bottom part of it and it opens two sides like this. So this picture, you're looking sideways at it, but if you squeeze the bottom, you see those two sides come apart, and it's made so you can put it up over a beam and then turn it and let go, and that round part ends up hanging from the beam. So the cool thing about this anchorage point is you can take it places, so it's not permanent. And that wire that it's made of actually acts as part of the deceleration device, because if somebody is hooked on the bottom of it and falls, the whole wire thing just stretches out. And that's part of the deceleration. But yeah, that thing is rated at 5,000 pounds if it's put on the correct kind of beam. So here's another type of anchorage point. These are actually made to be built into roofing. So if you look at the underside picture, it's got a C sleeve that goes over a building member. Usually it's a truss, and you clamp it down there, and then the rubber part goes underneath shingles or other roofing materials. This is permanent, so that you can have a place when you get up on the roof to, you know, make your air conditioner work every year, to have a tie off. So there's all kinds of permanent anchorage points around. And this one will be rated at 5,000 pounds. However, and here's the caveat for all of them, you have to install it as per manufacturer requirements. So this is another one we've got at the office that I think is kind of fun. It's actually a temporary anchorage point. It's made to go in a concrete wall. You drill a hole in the wall, the circle size that it tells you to, and then that spring underneath the orange thing, you pull it back, and it makes it so it goes in that hole, and then when you let go, it expands and holds the thing in the hole in the wall. And this is reversible. You can take it out. So if you have a nice, you know, building that has a concrete wall that you don't want this orange thing hanging out of permanently, because the lady in charge of the art in the place said that it's ugly, you can take this off. Excuse me. But if you put it in as according to manufacturer instructions, it can be rated at 5,000 pounds. One of the things I would caution people, you see those tags on that? It's yellow. You have to have the tags attached, or it's no good. It's not rateable if the tags aren't legible. And that's true of all fall protection equipment. If you can't read the tags, throw it away. It's not any good. Okay, so number 2 part of your system that you have to have, shock absorbing lanyard. So here's a picture of an old style, current style shock absorbing lanyard. The reason I say old style is that these things have been taken over by the retractable lanyards. Everybody likes retractable lanyards better now, because this old version was great engineering to start with. That shock absorbing pad in there, when it rips out, it's part of, you know, slowing you down when you fall, but you have to fall 6 feet for this thing to even begin to deploy. So you may end up having to fall quite a distance to get it to work. Some of these, they want it to have a 12-foot clearance above a lower level to make sure you don't hit the lower level. So here's the also caveat on this slide. If the combined body weight of the individual plus the tools is more than 310 pounds, the anchorage and other ratings in the system must be adjusted by a qualified person to greater than 5,000 pounds. So these shock absorbing lanyards are great, but like I said, it's pretty much been taken over by retractables. This is what one of those looks like when it's been ripped out. This white strap is inside of that section. As it rips out, it's basically sewed together in the middle. And what you're doing is you're ripping all those stitches, and that absorbs the energy of your fall and makes you slow down and stop. So it's a good system and it works, but it makes you fall 6 feet to make it work at least. So here's one that we confiscated from somebody. This is absolutely not an okayed lanyard. It has no shock absorber in it. If you were to fall on it with this on it, you would just like a yo-yo bounce up and down. So also another thing about this particular one, the clips on the end only require one action to open them up. And these kind of clips, it's easy to have roll out so that they'll actually become undone. So this is not good in two ways, but that's the only technology that they had prior to about 2000. Slow here. There we go. Okay. This is a picture of two different lanyards we have in our office that we actually confiscated because they are worn out. So if you have a lanyard that has a lot of wear and stitches are coming out, that kind of thing, like the top picture, excessive wear, that will disqualify it. If you have a lanyard like the bottom one where you can't even read anything on the tag, and believe it or not, the whole lanyard used to be that bright yellow. This is part of inspecting your equipment. UV sun rays will actually degrade the material these lanyards are made of and make it so they'll break and become brittle. So that's part of an inspection, is making sure that you're not having a faded lanyard. Also, the Pelican clips, which is what they call these clips that are on the one on the bottom, those in some cases are not legal anymore because they found that they actually broke. This is a lanyard that DBI Sala puts out. And this is what I'm talking about when I say technology has changed. These things, there's a little disc, it's a yellow disc you can see in the bottom picture. You have a reader that DBI Sala has available, and you just swipe it in front of that thing, and it has a unique number for that piece of equipment, and you can document the inspection on a computer with this little disc that's in this lanyard. Virtually all lanyards and harnesses nowadays have these kinds of RFID readers so that you can, keep track of them on a computer. And that's great because somebody in the office can be looking at the records and say, hey, wait a minute, this hasn't been inspected in its annual inspection, and know who it belongs to and call them in and say, hey, I want to inspect your lanyard or your harness. So it also, as you notice on the other picture, has a place to write somebody's name on it. So this is assigned to James. And that way, when you've got 10 harnesses that look all the same, you can write their name on it, and that way they know it's theirs. So here's a picture of another harness we have in the office. This one has 2 retractable lanyards attached to it. So has anybody in the room ever used a retractable lanyard? So I see one guy nodding his head back in the back. So what's so cool about these? How come this has taken over the industry? So he says he used to work in a warehouse and a retractable would limit your travel distance. And the thing that's really cool about them, if you've ever had a seatbelt on and stopped quickly, and that seatbelt stops, it grabs and makes it so you don't go towards the front window. That's what these do. If you fall in one of these, they will stop you in inches. Instead of having to fall 6 feet before my lanyard even deploys, these retractables will stop you like a seatbelt does. It's got that inertial lock, and if you yank on it hard, it stops like 2 inches. The issue with these, so if I have an old style that's the 6-foot lanyard and it rips out, it's toast, throw it away. If I have one of these and I fall in it, it has a telltale, they call it, that opens up and it has a red flaggy thing. And that says, oh, somebody's fallen in this. So that's a good indication just to look at it that it's been fallen in. And those are cool because you can take that retractable lanyard and send it back to the manufacturer. They can refurbish you this lanyard and send it back to you for a very small fee. It's not like you have to go out and buy another lanyard, which you used to have to do with those 6-foot lanyards. You had to go buy a whole nother one. These retractables, you can get them refurbished by the manufacturer and it's good to go. So retractables are great. There's one thing that I would caution people with. They come in as long as 25 feet of lanyard. The problem with that is if you get 25 feet out from your anchorage point and you fall off an edge, you could end up swinging and hit something. So just be aware that that's a danger with any lanyard that's that long. But especially retractables, because they do come in different lengths and you can get some that are that long. So it really depends on the situation where you're using it. Okay, so if you have a self-retracting lanyard, you can change the hardware requirements. Remember the old one is 5,000 pounds? This limits the free fall distance so much that they can actually download the anchorage point requirements to 3,000 pounds because it doesn't allow your body to build up that momentum. Because in 2 inches, you're not going to build that momentum. That's why they allow you to download it or downgrade it. But you need to have a competent person at least figure out if that's something that's useful for you. Okay, the third part of this system is you have to have a full body harness. And as I pointed out before, you really need to make sure that that harness is sized and weight rated for whoever you're planning to put in it. So that's the really important thing with harnesses. Also, if you don't have them correctly adjusted to the person and they fall in it, and if they hang for any length of time, you can actually cause physical problems like compression of your femoral arteries, and you can end up having blood clots that can go to your heart and brain and having, deaths because of it. So make sure that it fits right. It's properly adjusted. So they do mention body belts in the standard. Body belts have been outlawed for fall protection for years. This is a picture of a very old one. They can only be used for positioning devices now. And the reason they outlawed them is that if you fall in a body belt, you will have serious and maybe fatal internal injuries, and you could end up breaking your back. So body belts are a big no-no, unless you're just positioning somebody with it. Okay, so one of the things I tell people you cannot forget, and everybody thinks of this after the fact, if somebody falls at your work and they're wearing a harness and lanyard and they have the anchorage point and everything's okay and it stopped them, and they're now hanging there. How do you get them down? So here's another advantage of some of those retractables. Some of those retractable lanyards are now rated so that they can actually slowly lower you to the ground. So they stop the person, they stop that person from falling, and then after a set period of time, it's like a minute or something, then they just slowly start lowering them. So if you're close enough to the ground for that to work, that could be your rescue system. Nobody else has to be there. And that's a real advantage of those retractables. But if you don't have that, and we actually had one guy that was on a tower crane up at the University of Utah building a building, and he fell off the tower crane. He had his harness and lanyard on. He hung there for 2 hours while they tried to figure out how to get him down. So the problem with that is that you can sustain some real injuries that could be life-threatening if you do that. So if you're going to have somebody that's out there on a harness and lanyard, be sure that you have a plan in place to how are you going to rescue them if they actually fall, and have that in place before they go up there, because figuring it out after the fact is not good. You could end up with somebody with serious injuries. So these are just some examples of what a permanent anchorage point looks like. One thing about this particular kind of anchorage point, it comes with that number of screws, and they're all supposed to be in there or it doesn't get rated. So you have to put it in correctly. And you need to inspect anchorage points, because if you have them in a place that is subject to weather, for instance, they could be rusting, they could be wearing through. So this is an example of a positioning device where the guy can't move. This is actually a picture of a guy that sat down to eat his lunch on a skylight. And don't do that. Skylights are not made to hold people. This guy fell through the skylight and ended up dying when he hit the floor. It was a concrete floor. So yeah, be aware of all of the possible places that you could get hurt with falls. So this is just kind of a summary of what that is. And I've got some pictures at the end here of typical places we see falls. So these guys are roofing the roof. It's a flat roof, and the standard actually allows a warning line, but that's only if you keep the people within the warning line. So obviously this one guy is not near the warning line. Also, that parapet wall in front of him is not tall enough to act as a guardrail. So there are actually clamp-on guardrails you can get to put on top of a parapet wall. So maybe they should have considered that possibility if they needed to be that close to the wall. So here's one that we see actually quite a bit. Rebar sticking up out of something. Anybody falling on this rebar could certainly be impaled, and that happens. By the way, those little rebar caps that look like a mushroom, those are illegal. The rebar caps that you can use, they're about 4 inches square and they have a steel plate in them. Those mushroom ones, if you fall on one of those, it'll just make a bigger hole. So we don't want to do that. Those steel plate ones, yeah, you'll have bruises, but at least it won't impale you. Also, rebar is not a guardrail, like in this picture. So, you know, rebar is not strong enough to be a guardrail, so you can't use it as that. So can you see the fall hazard this guy is exposed to? Like I said, it seems like apartment buildings, the very last thing they put on is the guardrail on the edge of the balcony or the walkways. And that's this guy's problem. So if you can get within 6 feet of the edge, you have to have something keeping you from falling off. One of those things. guardrail, safety net, or personal fall protection system. So this is the correct way to do a guardrail where they're climbing onto the roof. So in one picture, they have a ladder that they're getting on there with. In another picture, they have some sort of stairway that has an actual door, spring-loaded door thing to it. It's making it so if there was somebody on the roof and they happen to keep walking, they would run into this guardrail. It's an offset to make them go around it before they enter the area where they need to get down. And it's hard to see in these pictures, but there's a guardrail made of cable leading up to the edge of these. That's pretty typical in construction. We see a lot of cable guardrails. A lot of times they'll tie tape or something that just makes them obvious to them. Okay, so you can get more information at the Utah Labor Commission, UOSH consultation. That's where I'm from. Also, because Utah has adopted all of these federal standards, there's a whole lot of tutorial information on the federal OSHA webpage, osha.gov. When you go on that webpage, I've found the easiest way to find stuff because their search engine on that webpage comes up with the most random things. Go to the top of the webpage, click on A to Z index, and you'll have all the topics fall down. And then what you want for this is fall protection. So F, go down to F and it will all be there. And they have a lot of resources that you can go and look at for making sure you've got the right kind of fall protection. But like I said, be careful. Don't put people in fall protection just because it's convenient. Maybe there's a better way. So maybe you can do this with a scissor lift or an articulated arm lift or even a scaffold. There's a lot of ways to keep people from being exposed to falls. This should not be your first line of, let's go with that. Besides the fact, fall protection systems cost money up front and you just can't leave them alone. They have to be inspected every time they get used, and then once a year, all the components. So anybody have any questions? Okay, so the question is, how do you have an internal inspection program to make sure your people are using your program? And Brody, is that your name? Yeah. He suggests they feed them breakfast once a year and they have to bring all their equipment with them. And that definitely would work for the annual inspection. Like I said, you have to, by OSHA standard, inspect these annually, all the stuff, the harness, the lanyard, the Anchorage points, at least annually. And depending on where they are, it might require more often than that, but that's something you have to determine. As far as getting people to use these systems, it's hard. It really is. When I was in the compliance side, one of the things we do as compliance officers is that we go around communities and we drive through communities and we look for construction sites. Well, the roofers are really easy to find because they're on the roof. Anyway, you drive through the construction sites and you find these roofers and you stop and talk to them. They're not wearing any kind of fall protection and get them off the roof. And there was a couple of guys in Grantsville one day. I stopped and they were sitting there on the roof, not doing anything. I said, well, how are you guys? Oh, we're fine. Can you come down here and talk to me? No, we can't. Well, why not? Our ladder blew over. So I put their ladder up so they could get off the roof. And then I brought them down. I said, did you guys know you're supposed to have fall protection? Yeah. Do you have fall protection? In our car. Why weren't you wearing it while you're up there on the roof? Because we work faster without it. And they get paid by the, I don't know, square footage of the roof they put on. Part of the issue is that if you pay in such a way that it incentivizes being faster rather than being safer, that's what you'll get. Also, it's back to, you have to convince people that yes, you need to wear this. It's important. It could mean your life. And honestly, for employers, you have to be hard-nosed about this. If you find them not wearing their fall protection when they are supposed to be, there's got to be pretty serious consequences. This is important, not just for you as an employer, but for them as their life. If you don't die of the fall, many people that I've investigated ended up paraplegic or quadriplegic. And that affects their families. It's awful. So you have to have a progressive discipline program in place and enforce it. And it's a good idea to have a supervisor go out and spot check these things. Don't just trust them. I mean, yeah, trust your people, but what is the word? Believe and verify, trust and verify. Absolutely. Because it is that important. And I'm afraid I would fire people if I'm willing to say, okay, you forgot once. And then, have a consequence for that, like days off without pay or something like that. But if they did it again, that would be it. And studies have actually been done about, who are the people who cause problems at workplaces. And it's interesting that a lot of people who cause and are the ones experiencing serious injuries is a minority. Most of the people at the workplace follow the rules and do the things they're supposed to. If you have a problem child, sometimes it's best to just not have that person. That's where progressive discipline programs come into play, and absolutely use them. Okay, any other questions? Oops, sorry. All right. Thanks for having me.